Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I will be giving you the top 10 armies of September. How this list works is that I take the armies that place top 3 at all the GTs and majors that took place during the month of September, and the armies that place top 3 more often get higher spots on the list. For tiebreakers, I take into account which placings the army got, whether they be first, second, or third, and if I need another tiebreaker, it comes down to the army spot on my previous top 10s. With that said, because many lists in competitive feature multiple factions, whatever detachment had the most points spent on it in an army is considered the main faction, while everything else would be considered as allies. But before we get into the main topic of this video though, this video was brought to you by the channel's newest sponsor, 9.5 Miniature Painting. 9.5 Miniature Painting is an up-and-coming painting commission service that offers great and affordable deals for their painting services. They are fairly new, but the stuff they have done already looks amazing. So if you're looking at getting a few units commissioned or even a whole army, check out 9.5 Miniature Painting on Instagram and send them a message to get a quote. A link to their Instagram will be in the description. So with that said, let's get into the top 10 armies of September. Number 10, Mech. That's right, the Mech have finally made it into the top 10 this month, and not as an honorable mention, but actually as part of the list. They had 2 third place finishes and were running lists very similar to each other. Both lists were Stygies, and their strategy heavily relied on infiltrating units, whether they be Dragoons or the Electro Priests. Both armies had guard allies because of the best command point battery in the game, which no longer is a thing due to the recent FAQ. Well, it is a thing, but not nearly as efficient as it once was. One list opted to bring a Knight as an ally as well, while the other list opted to bring a battalion of Blood Angels instead with 3 Smash Captains and 3 units of Scouts. One of the lists actually made use of the new Forge World drill that can be used to transport models, and I'm thinking they possibly used it for their priests instead of infiltrating them, but I can't say this for certain. With that said, both of these lists are pretty nerfed after the new FAQ because Infiltrate doesn't work anywhere close to how it used to, and is nowhere near as good as it once was. The guard battery isn't nearly as good as it once was either, and the Knight stratagems aren't as cheap as they once were. But I still feel like the Smash Captains are still relatively okay, even though they received a nerf in the FAQ as well, with no longer being able to charge over screening units. I've seen a lot of people complain about this, but personally, I think this was an okay change. You can still move over the screen in the movement phase and then charge your target, or you can shoot down the screen first and then charge your target. So there are ways to play around this nerf. Overall, I'm happy to see Mech on the top 10, but sadly with the changes to Infiltrate and how reliant on it I believe these lists were, I doubt we will see Mech in the top 10 again anytime soon. Number 9, Death Guard. The Sons of Mortarion are back in the top 10 this month, coming in at number 9 with a 2nd place finish and a 3rd place finish. The first list is somewhat unique in the fact that this player actually brought 3 Daredeo Dreadnoughts, which haven't really been seen on the top tables. Unfortunately, they didn't post their whole list, so I don't know what else was in it other than what you can see here. But in what they did show, they used 3 Plagueburst Crawlers and 3 Daredeos, which are all very resilient vehicles. The Plagueburst Crawlers are toughness 8 with a 5+ invul save and a 5+ feel no pain from disgustingly resilient, and the Daredeos have 14 wounds and a 5+ invul. Both of these units are also great for damage output. The Flamers on the Crawlers auto-hit and are really strong, while having decent anti-tank options with the mortar. And the Daredeos hit on 2s normally, so even if they move, they still hit on 3+. And they have a rule to gain +1 to hit against flyers if they don't move, so they will still be hitting most flyers in the game on 2+. Combine that with having a Chaos Lord nearby to reroll 1s, and you're going to be at almost 100% efficiency when it comes to your hits. As for the second list, this player opted to bring Chaos Demon allies with a mix of Nurgle and Khorne Demons, a unit of Bloodletters for a Deep Strike Bomb, and 2 units of Plague Bearers because they are very resilient and also pack a decent punch. They also synergized a lot with the other Nurgle stuff. He brought a Demon Prince of Khorne because it's a beast in close combat and can also give rerolls of 1s to the Bloodletters if he positions nearby, and a Poxbringer to buff the Plague Bearers and Demon vehicles from the Death Guard detachment. As for the actual Death Guard stuff, he brought a Chaos Lord for rerolls, a Foul Blightspawn, 2 Plagueburst Crawlers, and 2 Leviathan Dreadnoughts. So basically it was very close to the same strategy used by the first list, but with slight variations. Overall, I'm happy to see Chaos armies in the top 10 since I love me some Chaos, and I'm glad to see some new and unique builds that we haven't seen on top tables. Number 8, Tau. That's right, the Fish People are back in top 10 this month with 2 first place finishes. Unfortunately, one of the players opted to not upload their list to the Best Coast Pairings app, so I only have one list to talk about. The list was a Tau Sept and featured 2 regular battlesuit commanders in Shadowsun, alongside Darkstrider and a Cadre Fireblade. They also had a bunch of Fire Warriors, some shield drones, 3 units of sniper drones, a Riptide, and some broadside battlesuits. The army comes with a lot of firepower and can work like a giant death ball where they protect each other and synergize with one another, especially when it comes to fending off Overwatch through their ability for the greater good. And the Tau Sept gets to Overwatch on 5s instead of 6s, which helps them stay out of close combat, which is a place Tau really doesn't want to be. Fusion commanders are still a thing, but at least they aren't spammed 11 at a time like in the early days of 8th, and I'm glad we are seeing Tau in the top again even after the commander change. And Tau actually looks like Tau again, so I guess you could say that that change was for the greater good. Number 7. Drukhari. The Dark Eldar haven't changed spots this time around and are still sitting at the 7th spot with 1 second place finish and 2 third place finishes. 2 of the 3 lists were pure Drukhari, while the other list was a mix of Drukhari and 2 Craft World Eldar options. And all 3 lists actually featured some Raiders, which personally are not my preferred transport for Drukhari, as I prefer the quicker and harder to hit Venoms, but these players opted to go with the Raiders because it seems like they preferred them. The first list has some big squads of Cabalites that actually include a Splinter Cannon in each, which I assume go in the Raiders. And they equip the Raiders with Splinter Racks to get even more efficiency out of all of their Splinter shots. Then they have an Alatok detachment that actually included Imperial Knights Spear, which isn't a model we see very often, but he works well with the Rangers since he has a pretty good sniper that always wounds on a 2+, has a -3 AP and 3 flat damage. So combined with 3 units of Rangers, he can most likely pick off a small character each turn. And for his final detachment, he used a Supreme Command of Ulthwé with a Farseer, a Farseer Skyrunner, and a Spirit Seer, and with the 1 elite slot opted to bring a unit of 5 Wraithguard, which aren't normally seen in top lists. I assumed he used the Psychers to buff the hell out of these guys, and just blew up tanks all day with their Strength 10, -4 AP, and D6 damage Wraith Cannons. I assume they might have also taken the spells Doom and Jinx, since those spells work amazing with the entire list. As for the next Drukhari list, they included a Cabal of Blackheart, which looks pretty standard. They used a cult detachment of the Cult of Cursed Blade, which is a cult I personally haven't seen in a top list. That cult is the one that gets +1 strength, and only 1 model flees from morale if they fail a check. And then, of course, a Prophets of Flesh detachment with some Talos. And the third list I'm not going to talk about because I feel like I've been talking about Drukhari enough already, but I'll show the list just in case you want to see it so you can pause it and check it out. Overall, I'm glad Drukhari is still doing well since it's my second favorite faction in the game, and I'm glad we're seeing some cool and unique lists from them. Number 6. Thousand Suns. First off, let me start by saying Magnus did nothing wrong, but also the Thousand Suns had a 1st, 2nd, and 3rd place finishes during the month of September. The first list was pretty standard Thousand Suns detachment, with a couple Demon Princes and Ahriman, a Shaman, 2 units of Cultists, and a big blob of Zangors, which is basically the Tzeentch version of Bloodletters, but arguably better because their attack twice stratagem is cheaper, and they synergize with the Thousand Suns better because of buffs and spells. The second detachment was a Tzeentch Demon detachment with 2 big pink horror blobs and 1 small unit of Brimstones, alongside a Changeling and Herald of Tzeentch or Fluxmaster for the people who have joined in 8th edition. And a Supreme Command detachment of Khorne Demons with a Herald of Khorne or a Bloodmaster and 2 Demon Princes. This list works really well by protecting all of the characters, and the only thing the opponent has a chance to shoot at are chaff units like the Cultists, Zangors, or Horrors, which are all pretty expendable, but also somewhat durable with their 4+ invols. And yes, Zangors can get a 4+ invol with the spell Weaver of Fates. You can also make them -1 to hit as well, which means your enemy is most likely going to target the Horrors, which aren't as viable as the Zangors, at least in my opinion. And the characters get to fly up the board with immunity due to the character rule until they are delivered into glorious melee combat, while also smiting the crap out of everything. And the second list is completely different in the fact that it's not character spam or even smite spam. It just has a Demon Prince of Tzeentch with a Sorcerer and a unit of Cultists with 2 big units of Zangors. The next detachment is a patrol of Death Guard that brings the dreaded 10 Blightlord Terminators that are stupidly resilient and hard to kill while also packing a decent punch. And then a detachment of Demons with some more pink horrors, but this time opting to bring some Nurglings for infiltration denial and also as durable objective holders. And I have a third list to talk about, but the writing is so small and my eyesight is so bad that I can't make it out. But overall, I'm glad my favorite faction in the game is getting some love and seeing some play on the top tables. And again, I'm glad it's with diverse lists and not just the same copy and paste stuff. Number 5. Imperial Knights. Now for clarity, these are not the lists that top Nova. The Nova lists are technically Catachan lists because more points are spent on the Catachan detachment. With that said, we have 3 actual Imperial Knight lists that topped events in September with a first place finish and 2 second place finishes. There's really not much to say about Knights other than some lists just aren't built to take them on, and it's not really their fault. They have to build lists to be able to deal with Drukhari, Astra Militarum, and a bunch of armies that spam cheap and small units, like the Thousand Suns list we just discussed. So when you build to be able to beat those lists and end up against Knights, you just don't have nearly enough anti-tank to deal with them, so the Knights are almost an anti-meta army, so to speak. And even though they are meta now, if you bring enough anti-tank to kill them, and then you're low on anti-infantry, and if you go up against lists like the previous ones I mentioned for Thousand Suns, they are most likely going to kill you. It's a very hard balancing act to design a list for the current meta for a lot of armies. But to talk about the actual lists, the list combined Big Knights with some guard for the endless command point battery that is now dead, or at least severely nerfed. These armies might still be around in the upcoming meta, but also might not be due to all the nerfs they received in the last FAQ. I don't think the army is dead, but I do think they lost a bit of power, so we will have to wait and see how other players feel about it. Number 4. Harlequins. For the first time ever, Harlequins are on the top 10 list, but you Harley players might be a little upset at the list. The main part of all of the Harlequin list was an outrider of their bikers and big units, while the rest of their lists were either Drukhari and Craft Worlds. One of the lists is only called Harlequins because it literally had 1 more point spent on it over the Drukhari detachment. So it's still technically a Harlequin list, but really at that point I'd rather just call the list Eldari. But based off of how the factions work for this list, they are a Harlequin list. But with that said, the list did feature a ton of bikes, which in my opinion are the strongest part of Harlequins. Their transports are too expensive for what they offer, and same with the troops in my opinion. Their characters are also pretty good, including the Solitaire, but after that, that's pretty much it. I feel like they are the custodies of the Eldari races. Only the bikes are optimal in tournament lists, it seems. With that said though, I'm glad Harlequins made it on the list this time around, even if it was only because of list technicalities. And before we get into the top 3, let's give some honorable mentions. These lists either placed 4th or 5th, or had 1 placing in the top 3, which wasn't good enough to edge out the armies that actually made it onto the list. But we have Ultramarines with a 4th place finish, Sisters of Battle with a 5th place finish, Nurgle Demons with a 5th place finish, Orcs with a 5th place finish, and Custodes with a 3rd place finish being edged out by AdMech. Now let's get into the top 3 armies of September. Number 3. Tyranids. The army that inspired the creation of Zerg and StarCraft is back on the top tables again, and this time around with some lists that we haven't really seen before, with a 1st, 2nd, and 2 3rd place placings. The first list is a very shooting heavy list featuring a lot of Carnifexes, some Hive Guard, and some Imperial Guard. That's right, Imperial Guard is even making its way into Tyranids' allies. This player brought an auxiliary detachment of 1 Magus from Genestealer Cult, which unlocks the use of Imperial Guard alongside Tyranid. The Imperial Guard part of the list was 3 Leman Russ Conquerors, and a Death Corps Marshal that brought Grand Strategist and the Kirov Zakila. The second list looks more like your typical Nids meta list, with a couple of Hive Tyrants, a bunch of Genestealers, and some Genestealer Cult allies. The third list is very similar to the first list in the fact that it combines Nids with Genestealer Cult and Guard. And the fourth list spammed a bunch of Gaunts, backed up by a bunch of the Thrope units like Zoanthropes, some Hive Guard, and again Genestealer Cult allies. I can see these types of armies getting stronger in the future when Genestealer Cult actually gets their own codex and Games Workshop fixes their infiltrate mechanic, because after the latest FAQ, Genestealer Cult was pretty heavily nerfed because the main thing that made them viable was the way they infiltrated. But with the changes from the FAQ, this is no longer possible. So overall though, I'm glad to see some more diversity in the top list, and I can't wait to see how Nids do when the Genestealer Cult Codex is released. Number 2. Astra Militarum. This month the Guard drops 1 spot and sits comfortably at the number 2 spot. They had 1 first place, a 3rd place, and 2 second place finishes that made them nudge out the Nids by a tiny bit. 3 of these 4 lists were all from one event, and it was the infamous Nova list that was seen almost everywhere at Nova. These lists were 1st, 2nd, and 3rd at that event. It included a brigade of Catachan, a battalion of Blood Angels with 3 Smash Captains, and the dreaded Castellan Knight. The list was super efficient because it combined the cheapest brigade in the game, which gave a ton of command points and bodies, alongside the best command point battery in the game, especially when combined with the Blood Angels relic that regains points as well. And all these command points funded the Castellan and the Smash Captains to basically have an infinite amount of command points so they could work at maximum efficiency for most of, if not the entire game. Funnily enough, this list didn't really see much play after Nova, even though Nova was at the beginning of September, meaning people had a good amount of time to hear about it and mimic it. But with the FAQ on the horizon, I assume a bunch of people were smart enough to hold off until the changes because Games Workshop held back releasing the FAQ due to the results of Nova. So it was pretty safe to assume Games Workshop was going to nerf the list in some way, and sure enough they did just that. Most of the stratagems that were heavily used by the list, which made it so efficient, were raised in points cost while also changing the way command point regen works, so the list couldn't have an infinite amount of command points anymore. These changes didn't necessarily kill the list, but it did nerf it overall. I'm happy Games Workshop didn't use the full ban hammer, as I would hate to see any one army just get deleted from the game. As you can see from this top 10, we have a decent amount of variety going on, and there's no need to delete one list from existence, especially because nerfs to that one list are going to affect other lists overall that don't abuse the same mechanics like the command point battery. Overall, I'm glad this list saw some changes because it definitely needed them, but I'm glad Games Workshop didn't go overboard with it, so people who did go out and buy the list can still play it if they like. Just not to the same efficiency it had before, which was a little over the top in my opinion. Number 1, the best army of September goes to Inari. And that's it for this video. If you liked it... Alright, I was just kidding. But that's right, my most disliked faction is in the top 10 once again, and this time at the number 1 spot. The army had 3 first place finishes and 1 third place finish to beat out Guard this time around. The first list was a generic Inari detachment with a Vrain, some Shining Spears, some Dark Reapers, with a blob of Guardians and some Rangers to fill out the battalion. They also had a Supreme Command of Ulthwé to get Eldrad in there for some more psychic shenanigans that complement the rest of the list and adds a lot of versatility. They also included a Vanguard detachment of Harlequins, which included a bunch of characters and a unit of Skyweavers, which are the Harlequin bikes. The second list was pretty much the same stuff, but in a larger quantity, with more Reapers and Spears, but also included a small battalion of Blackheart Drukhari to gain access to the Agents of Vex stratagem, which is still one of the strongest stratagems in the game, even after the nerf from the FAQ. And the last list was very unique from the other two in the fact that this player opted to bring Prophets of Flesh Coven for some beefy and durable units, and an Inari battalion that actually included the Incarn instead of Vrain, who is the more common pick for the Inari HQ. This list also included an auxiliary detachment of Blackheart Cabalites in order to gain access to the Blackheart stratagem Agents of Vex, since at Nova it was ruled you needed Blackheart units to unlock the stratagem. So this player opted to bring the cheapest choice possible with one 30-point unit of Cabalites. This was probably seen as an exploit, and I'm assuming was the main reason Games Workshop changed the Blackheart stratagem to state you need Blackheart units on the board. So with this new change, this little exploit doesn't work nearly as well because you can just use some mortars to blast the 30-point unit off the field, which stops that player from being able to use Agents of Vex. And the fourth list wasn't posted, so I can't really talk about it, but I assume it's closer to the first 2 lists I mentioned, since those seem to be the more popular builds for Inari. Overall, I'm glad we're seeing some unique lists since I love diversity in the game, and although I don't necessarily like the Inari faction, I'm glad Games Workshop hasn't nerfed them to the point of non-existence. The army has a very high skill ceiling and a very high skill floor, so from my experience, it only really does well when in the hands of a very skilled player, so that's the balance of them. In the hands of an unskilled player or an average player, the army is okay, but in the hands of a very skilled player, the army is almost unstoppable, which makes it very hard for Games Workshop to balance properly. Anyways, that's it for the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more competitive Warhammer 40k content. And if you want to help support the channel even further, you can do so on Patreon. A pledge of $5 gets you access to the exclusive Almost Pro Gaming Discord channel, where you can get help from myself with list building and basic coaching. And you can also chat with a community of players who love the game just as much as you do. Also, don't forget to check out the channel's sponsors, 9.5 Miniature Painting and themagnetbaron.com. I already talked about 9.5 Miniature Painting, but themagnetbaron.com offers magnets of all sizes, magnetized movement trays, magnetized flight stands, and they even offer fully built and magnetized models, all for a great price. So if you're looking at picking up any magnets for your hobbying needs, then check out themagnetbaron.com. So yeah, check out the sponsors if they offer something you're looking for, and also check out my Patreon since that's the best way to support the channel and it allows me to continue making these videos full time. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Happy wargaming!